The elevator hadn't even reached my floor when my phone vibrated. Payroll deduction applied, late arrival, 2 minutes. Approved by D. Caldwell. No conversation, no context, just a system notification and a name I had never met. Derek Caldwell, the new head of operations. He had joined a week ago, sent one welcome email, and started slashing. First came the Friday overtime rule, then the performance-based reassignments. Then this, an automatic penalty for 2 minutes. I didn't argue. I just stepped off the elevator, walked past the operations bay, and logged in like I always did. Except this time, I didn't stay logged in. My name is Carolyn, 38. I built the internal clearing architecture at Devlin & Hart, the framework that processes and audits over 40 million in weekly transactions without fail. For 9 years, I had kept it stable. No major loss, no reconciliation delays, no data leak. My system didn't collapse. It absorbed impact. Quietly, efficiently, invisibly. But that was the problem, wasn't it? People don't respect what they can't see. Derek came from a logistics firm. High volume, low trust. He believed in visibility, loud dashboards, instant performance pings, discipline as a feature. He called it culture recalibration. But we all knew what it meant. Clear out the old guard, keep the loyal, and replace control with compliance theater. The salary deduction wasn't an accident. It was a message. And I heard it. That afternoon, he held his first all-hands meeting. He didn't address me. He introduced Alina Morse, his former assistant, now special advisor to operations continuity. She smiled like she belonged. She didn't even ask what my team did. She just said, "We'll simplify everything." I watched her delete the backup failover logs on her first day. I watched Derek nod. They didn't ask for input. They didn't need sabotage. They needed silence. So I gave it to them. I removed myself from the last chain of active override approvals. I locked the root access key behind a passive time delay protocol. Not hidden, not malicious, just policy, the one they never bothered to read. And when the last approval came in that evening, a 1.6 slower transaction flagged for routing delay, I didn't correct the tag. I let it sit. Because the system I designed only works when someone understands why it was built that way. And Derek? He only saw slow. So he asked Alina to streamline it, and I started counting. Alina didn't ask what the red flags meant. She renamed them. "Too many escalation triggers," she said brightly, clicking through dashboards like they were puzzles. "If we want to run lean, we need to normalize what used to be exceptions." Derek didn't blink. Approved. Push it to live. He didn't ask why the triggers existed. He didn't question what they'd catch. He only cared about the optics. That Alina moved fast and I moved carefully. And careful didn't fit the culture anymore. I was removed from the routing review team that same day. My name vanished from the high-risk ticket queue. I didn't protest. I handed Alina everything she asked for. Templates, access maps, handover docs, all formatted, all clean, all stripped of the logic beneath. She didn't notice what was missing. She didn't even know what to look for. She implemented a rule merge immediately, collapsed 3-tier verification into single-pass approvals for non-client accounts. I watched her copy-paste the logic directly from a policy I had written 4 years ago, then delete the exception notes that kept the system safe. But this time, I didn't step in. Instead, I reactivated a dormant transaction ID, internal clearance 44F. On paper, it looked harmless, an old internal settlement pipeline tied to a vendor we no longer used. In reality, it was more than that, a known volatile thread I'd frozen months ago due to an unresolved compliance mismatch on escrow routing. It was safe only because it was untouched. If reintroduced, it would trigger a legal discrepancy across jurisdictions. And Alina, she pulled it back into circulation, accidentally, when she imported a batch of legacy items to restructure. She didn't read the embedded conditions, didn't know the vendor's external auditor still had access to mirrored logs, didn't realize escrow loop B was on watch. I saw her do it. I watched her eyes skim over the row and press reactivate. She thought it was dead data, but I had been grooming 44F for weeks, making sure it stayed dormant until the right moment. Now it had a new owner, her signature, her timestamp, her decision. I opened a plain doc and labeled it Escrow Routing Conflict, Reference Trigger 44F. No accusations, no metadata, just dates, figures, and 3 lines of logic. I uploaded it to a folder named Legacy Training, Internal Use Only. That folder auto-syncs to the compliance server every 72 hours, and they're trained to spot mismatched triggers tied to external audit flags. Alina wouldn't see it coming. Neither would Derek. They thought I'd gone quiet, that I'd accepted my demotion, my deduction, my irrelevance. But I wasn't quiet, I was surgical. And now the incision was made. I requested a step down from tiered authorization, citing alignment with updated operation structure. Derek approved it instantly. He thought he'd finally buried the last layer of resistance. But the truth was, he'd just removed the only shield standing between his team and the audit logs. And when 44F goes live, and the partner firm's automated validator starts asking why an inactive contract routed funds without dual verification, only one name will be tied to the override, and it won't be mine. The first alert didn't come from IT, it came from Lornex Group, a short, neutral email. No alarm, no threat, just a line that said, seeking clarification on routing behavior observed in recent fund movement. Reference, Contract 44F. Attached was a red-flagged activity log. External review had caught something no one internally had noticed. Yet, Alina saw it first. She forwarded it to Derek with the note. Looks like some legacy dust. I'll tidy up. Derek, predictably, loop in ops, no escalation needed, no escalation. That was his mantra. Not accuracy, not clarity, just containment. Keep things quiet, keep control. But this wasn't something he could mute, because the message had a CC, Rajan Khoury, our compliance lead. The second message came just 2 hours later. Same sender, different tone. For legal protection, we are pausing all fund activity tied to 44F until formal confirmation is provided. Lornex didn't ask twice. They froze everything. The fund, the processing queue, the reconciliation path. $4.5 million, suddenly motionless. Rajan flagged it immediately. He messaged Alina. She didn't answer. Too busy on a call, pitching trust-based clearance to another department she barely understood. Derek stayed silent, assuming this would pass like a system hiccup. It didn't. By 3:40 p.m., legal was involved. By 4:05, finance requested internal routing logs for the week prior. And by 4:30, someone opened the archive folder. Legacy training, internal use only. That's where they found it, the document I left, titled plainly, Escrow Routing Conflict, reference trigger 44F. Written in my voice, dated a week earlier. No accusations, just logic flow, routing history, and the condition. If reactivated, contract will bypass multi-verification due to override structure. Rajan didn't email me. He didn't need to. He sent the file to legal with one note. Warning was issued, not addressed. It spread fast. Audit flags lit up. Alina's user ID was tied to the reactivation. The approval log bore her initials. Not forged, not tricked, just rushed. Derek tried to slow it down. Probably a misclassification. These systems hold old logic. It happens. But legal had already marked the override as unjustified. Not malicious, just unvalidated. And unvalidated under an active compliance contract equals reportable risk. They didn't need intent. They had impact. I spent that evening clearing out my inbox. Quietly, no drama. I archived nothing, deleted nothing. I didn't need to, because every file worth reading had already been read. At 6:13 p.m., Alina walked over. Did you know that contract was still active? I didn't look up. I assumed you reviewed the queue before pushing changes? She hesitated. I didn't think it'd trigger anything serious. I finally looked at her. You're lucky it only triggered a freeze. She left without another word, but I knew the look on her face. It wasn't confusion, it was realization. That the game wasn't hers to control, and I hadn't lifted a finger. I just stepped aside. By Thursday morning, compliance had opened what they called a targeted logic trace. Not a full-blown investigation, not yet, just a quiet internal crawl through every modified rule, approval map, and user-defined override made in the last 10 business days. Alina's ID came up 14 times. Derek's came up 9. Rajan requested copies of every change that touched routing logic. He didn't ask for justification, just timestamps. He didn't need blame. He needed sequence. Derek sent a note to legal. Alina was operating under a modernization directive I signed. I approved the restructuring as part of the new operational model. It was supposed to sound responsible. It read like consent. Meanwhile, Lornex sent their own request. Please disclose who authorized the reactivation of Contract 44F and whether internal oversight reviewed the implications. That wasn't a question. That was a trap because oversight had been dissolved, voluntarily, on record, by Derek himself. They started panicking behind closed doors. I knew because Rajan sent me a single message. Did you scrub the archive? I answered truthfully. No, I just left breadcrumbs where someone honest would find them. He didn't reply. But 5 minutes later, access to the legacy training folder spiked. 9 concurrent opens. Someone was checking cross-references. Another was scanning metadata. A third, cross-verifying policy version histories. What they found wasn't a cover-up. It was worse. It was traceable negligence. Clear edits, removed notes, bypassed logic paths, all manually approved. Every change documented by the system. No one forged anything. They had done it cleanly, boldly, and publicly. At 2:11 p.m., Finance issued a pre-audit freeze on all transactions above 1M pending dual verification reactivation. The delay cost us half a day's velocity and created a client-level bottleneck in the Brazil division. Derek called it overkill. Rajan called it containment. I said nothing. I walked to the print center and collected 1 copy of the archived verification flow, my original diagram marked up with red annotations. I highlighted 3 removed conditions and wrote in ink, "These existed for a reason." Then I left it on the compliance cart. No note, no signature, just clarity. That night, legal ran a session with operations to refresh protocol memory. Derek didn't attend. Alina sat in the back, didn't speak. Halfway through, someone asked, "Who wrote the original version of this?" The room went quiet. Someone answered, "She used to sit over there." I wasn't there to hear it, but that silence was the moment everything shifted. Because now it wasn't about recovery. It was about what they'd erased without understanding. And nothing triggers an audit faster than that. Derek tried to get ahead of it. He called a 10 a.m. meeting with compliance, legal, and ops. No agenda, no notes, no recording. Just 4 people in a room with a locked door and nervous glances. I wasn't invited. I didn't need to be. By then, the question wasn't what went wrong. It was who let it go through. Rajan opened the meeting with a 1-pager. At the top, Contract 44F, reactivation timeline. Beneath it, system logs, signature history, and a sequence of approval flow changes. Derek tried to wave it off, called it old logic resurfacing under new load. But Rajan cut in. This isn't resurfacing. This is manual override. Clean, logged, time-stamped. Alina stayed quiet. Her initials were on every line. Legal leaned in. Who cleared the restructuring of verification rules? Derek answered too quickly. I authorized it as part of operational streamlining. We didn't expect it to affect frozen contracts. Rajan, but you didn't consult the owners of those contracts? Some of those rules existed for compliance-grade escrow only. Derek paused. Then, well, so those owners weren't responsive. He meant me, but that was a mistake, because Rajan had already reviewed the archive logs. He had seen the document I left. The warning was real, dated, traceable. And worst of all, it had been ignored. Not lost, not hidden, just disregarded. Finance entered the picture that afternoon. They weren't subtle. They requested a formal explanation for the freeze, the estimated reconciliation delay, and whether any penalties were likely to be triggered under contract terms. The total amount at risk, $4.5 million. The silence that followed lasted 7 seconds. Rajan broke it. He sent a follow-up memo to legal and finance. Per review, override was applied without validation against legacy escrow terms. Control measures had been documented. They were removed by current approvers. Recommend immediate retention of all related correspondence. Derek called me that evening, first time in weeks. "Kara," he said, trying for casual. "Just checking. Do you happen to remember when 44F was initially shelved?" I said nothing. Because legal seems to think there was a compliance note attached. I can't seem to find it. I paused, then calmly. "You deleted the folder that held it. You said it was inefficient." He exhaled sharply. "I didn't delete. Alina managed the cleanup." "That's funny," I said, "because her name's on the override. Yours is on the directive." He didn't reply. I could hear it then. Not anger, not denial, just the sound of someone realizing. The floorboards had already cracked. He thought I'd been erased, but I had become the watermark, and now, no matter where they looked, they couldn't unsee me. Alina broke first. Not in tears, not in panic, and something worse, confusion with power still in her hand. It began with an internal request from legal. Please submit a written summary of your understanding of escrow routing Layer B as applied to legacy contracts such as 44F. She sent a chart, a bright, oversimplified flow, boxes, arrows, color-coded logic. It was clean, polished, and completely wrong. Her model treated 44F as a dormant shell, an archive ghost, no risk tags, no live routing. But Lornex had already forwarded their own logs to compliance, and their logs showed 44F was flagged active risk, escrow-bound, with a jurisdiction-specific clause that required dual confirmation before any reactivation. Kara had documented that clause in a policy file titled Exception Protocol, Conditional Contracts. Alina had deleted that file 2 weeks ago, but she didn't know the system had kept a server-side cache. Triggered when any file affecting external compliance terms was accessed, it was automatically copied to the audit trail. Rajan found it. He didn't say a word in the cross-functional meeting. He just slid a printout across the table to legal. The heading, Audit Sync Copy 17 days ago. At the bottom, accessed by A. Morse. Deleted by A. Morse override issued by A. Morse. Derek tried to redirect the meeting. This is being framed as a compliance issue, but it's really a technical misalignment. Let's not assign fault too quickly. But finance had joined the call that morning, and they weren't interested in theory. They were preparing to disclose the freeze to an investor report. 4.5 million had stalled under preventable error. 2 clients had delayed payment cycles due to internal turbulence. And someone, anyone, needed to be accountable. Alina asked for a one-on-one with Rajan. He declined. Instead, he issued a formal reconstruction request. Permission to restore the last stable state of the transaction rule set before the override. That version, the one Kara had authored, Kara who hadn't touched the system in 10 days. Kara who had been erased from ops access. Kara whose name appeared again, this time not in blame, but in retrieval. Alina messaged me that night. I didn't know 44F was live. I replied only, then why did you push it? I thought it was legacy. I didn't realize it triggered Lornex validation. That's why we had safeguards. You could have warned me. I didn't argue. I did. She stopped typing. Then, would you be willing to explain the routing to legal? Maybe if you clarify things, this won't spiral further? I answered with a question. What was the purpose of escrow loop B? She replied, it's the redundancy thing, right? The backup? Wrong. It wasn't a backup. It was a jurisdiction lock, specifically for Brazilian financial regulators. A single misstep could trigger a disclosure flag. It wasn't just an internal headache. It was a cross-border compliance breach, and she'd sent it live. Not maliciously, not strategically, just carelessly. She wasn't the villain, but she was no longer fit to hold the controls. That same night, I got an alert. Access reinstatement request submitted. Approver, Rajan Corey. I didn't request reinstatement. He initiated it, quietly. No announcement, no praise, just a system line. Access required to complete audit clarification. That was his way of saying what no one else had the clarity to admit. They needed me back, not to lead, not to clean, but to define what the others had tried to improvise. This time, I wouldn't rebuild. I'd anchor, and no one would be allowed to call it over-engineering again. Derek entered the meeting room at precisely 10:02 a.m., still carrying the weight of his title as if it meant immunity. On paper, he was the head of operations, the one entrusted to restructure, reform, and redefine efficiency. In his mind, this was a temporary inconvenience. The freeze was an anomaly, the audit an overreaction, and Alina's disappearance, an unfortunate but manageable disruption. But in the room, no one moved like they believed him anymore. Rajan had already prepared a full incident trace. Not a document, not a theory, an animated overlay of override activities over the past 30 days. Each action pulsed on screen, tagged by user and timestamp. Alina's profile showed in sharp, frantic clusters. Derek's appeared in regular intervals, steady, deliberate. No one spoke. Not because they were afraid to, but because the silence said more than anyone needed to add. Derek opened with a measured tone. He explained that the issue had stemmed from outdated routing logic inherited from prior versions of the system, that the reactivation of Contract 44F was an unfortunate collision between legacy processes and modern streamlining. He assured the room that rollback protocols were in place, that safeguards were being reinstated, that structural simplification would continue, but with greater sensitivity. What he didn't realize was that no one in the room believed they were still simplifying anything. They were salvaging. Alina was absent. Her access removed, her name now circulating in audit logs and legal memos, quietly but definitively erased. She had been the executor, yes, but Derek had authored the directives. Every signature, every override, every removed approval layer led back to his user ID. He tried to soften the edges, spoke about intention, trust, speed, framed it as a shared lapse in judgment, but the room wasn't buying it. Finance had already triggered preliminary disclosure. Legal was preparing containment language for board briefing, and compliance had moved from reviewing logs to reconstructing accountability. At the far end of the room, I sat silently. No badge, no job title, no return announcement, just visibility, restored, reinstated, and, most of all, respected, now that silence had done what arguments never could. When Derek finally turned to me, he spoke as if he still had authority. Kara, any insight on how we might prevent this sort of fragility going forward would be appreciated. I didn't respond right away, not because I didn't have words, but because I needed the room to feel the difference between being asked for help and being asked to undo damage they had caused together. Then I said calmly, "You removed depth because you didn't understand what it was for." He blinked. "You replaced caution with convenience. You called safeguards bottlenecks. You deleted resilience and labeled it optimization." He tried to answer. I didn't let him. The system didn't fail you. It resisted you. Until it couldn't anymore. The table went still. Legal turned slightly in her chair and asked, "If we were to restore what was lost, fully, where would we begin?" I looked straight ahead. "By not restoring from backup," I said, "by redesigning from memory, starting with the question you refused to ask, not what failed, but why didn't it fail sooner?" That landed, because they all knew the answer. It hadn't failed sooner, because someone had quietly made sure it wouldn't, until they were removed. And now that person was back in the room, not to rebuild, but to make sure this time it couldn't be erased again. Derek was never fired. He still had his title, still had his office, and technically still had his decision rights. But the erosion didn't come with an announcement. It came slowly, deliberately from the edges inward. He stopped receiving direct questions. He was left off scheduling threads. Reports that once landed in his inbox were rerouted for visibility. Compliance briefings happened without him. Audit updates arrived late or not at all. One by one, the threads of authority he'd wrapped around himself began to unspool, quietly, without confrontation. He wasn't removed. He was bypassed. Alina's status had been marked inactive 3 days earlier. Her credentials were suspended under process review, and her role absorbed into a cross-departmental rotation that, conveniently, required no new hire. There was no farewell email, no explanation. Derek didn't speak her name again. Instead, he tried to reclaim control through symbolism. He scheduled a stability town hall, drafted a 3-page memo on resilience culture. No one replied. Half the invitees marked decline. The other half never opened it. I wasn't among them. My invitation never came. I was in a different room, with Rajan, with finance, with legal, with those who'd spent the last 2 weeks picking apart what Derek had overwritten. Not to reassign blame, but to reconstruct what had been destroyed too quickly to understand. They didn't ask me to take my role back. They asked me to draw a new boundary. I gave them one document, one line. No critical decision may be made by individuals who cannot explain the full scope of its consequences, in real time, under audit conditions. It wasn't a rule, it was a test. If someone couldn't stand at a table and justify a change, not with slides, not with titles, but with logic, they didn't get to make it, not anymore. The line passed, quietly, immediately. By the end of the week, Derek's access to operational decision tools had been transferred for continuity. His approval authority reduced to ceremonial fields that no longer triggered actual change. A shell of authority, preserved only to avoid triggering severance clauses too early. He still came to the office, sat behind frosted glass, answered irrelevant emails. But he was no longer steering anything. And he knew it. He tried to call me once. I let it ring, because there was nothing left to discuss. They had deducted my salary for being 2 minutes late. Now they delayed launch cycles by 2 days, just to make sure they fully understood what they were touching. I didn't lecture anyone. I didn't draft a manifesto. I let them rediscover caution on their own, and when they asked what I thought of the changes, the reversions, the approvals, the new hierarchy, I said only this: you finally stopped mistaking speed for competence. No one argued, because they all knew the price of confusing the two. Revenge was never the goal, but there's something colder than revenge. A room full of people finally understanding that the damage wasn't done by error, it was done by arrogance. And now they couldn't afford to ignore the silence anymore, because the silence had outlasted them all. The system came back online in phases, not with fanfare, not with a launch email, just quiet reconciliations clicking into place, one contract at a time. There were no speeches, no apology tours, just restored parameters, double verification triggers, jurisdictional controls returning like the bones of a structure someone had tried to paint over. The 4.5 million wasn't lost, but what had been lost was harder to measure. Trust in shortcuts, in titles, in the belief that authority implied understanding. Derek never came back to full capacity. He still showed up, still had a title on the org chart, but the ecosystem had adjusted without him. Legal no longer routed approvals his way. Finance removed him from project funding workflows. Compliance reports listed his name only as a footnote. Previously designated approver, inactive authorization. And Alina, her departure wasn't even registered as a disruption. She disappeared so completely that when a new hire asked who had written a flawed workflow from 3 months earlier, no one remembered to mention her. That was the real exit, the kind no severance clause can fix. I didn't rejoin the command chain. That was never the point. They had offered me titles, interim roles, compensation packages. I declined all of them, not out of pride, out of design. I didn't want to return to a seat someone else could undermine again. I wanted to write the rule that no one could bypass. So I submitted a document. No logo, no legalese, just a sentence at the center of the page. A control you don't understand is not overhead. It's protection you haven't needed yet. They adopted it as doctrine. It wasn't a policy technically, but it was cited in 5 departments within a week. A copy was framed outside the new compliance room. Another printed and tucked into onboarding packets. A third was engraved, literally, into the metal frame of the ops planning table. I never asked them to do any of it, but I understood why they did. People don't remember everything that failed, but they remember what almost broke them. And this time, the fracture had a shape. Not a villain, not a hero, just a gap where someone should have asked, why was this layer here? The audit finalized quietly. No one was fired, but 2 people were moved into advisory roles. One of them had an office, the other had a reputation. And me, I started writing. Not emails, not directives, but memories, how systems were built, why they were layered, what each bypass trigger had been designed to catch. I wasn't building a playbook, I was building institutional memory, because that's what no one accounted for when they deleted my access. It wasn't just my logic they removed, it was my memory of why the logic mattered. And now it was that memory that stood between them and the next failure. They never thanked me, not in a memo, not in a town hall, not even in passing. And that was exactly how I wanted it, because the kind of revenge I carried was never about recognition. It wasn't about getting the credit or the corner office or a redemption arc whispered through the hallways. It was about ensuring that what happened once could never happen again, at least not for the same reasons. The documents I wrote weren't policy, they were memory. I compiled diagrams, notes, even hand-drawn decision trees explaining why certain blocks had been created. I listed what each clause had prevented, not hypothetically, historically. I didn't name the people who ignored those warnings. I didn't need to. Their absence was explanation enough. Eventually, people began asking to speak with me again, not to report, to verify. A project lead would swing by and say, before we sunset this process, can we confirm why it exists? A junior analyst would email late at night, does this fall under the old threshold rule? And I would respond, not with instructions, but with reminders, not what to do, but what happens when no one remembers why it was done a certain way. The change was slow, but deep. Decisions took longer. Meetings added a new question to every final proposal. What's the cost of being wrong? That question hadn't existed before. It does now. Derek eventually resigned, quietly. 3 months after the freeze lifted, his exit was framed as career realignment. There was no farewell post, no send-off drinks. People forgot to ask where he went. That's how power leaves when it's built on performance alone. Alina never resurfaced. Her digital trace within the company ended the week she left. No one called her a saboteur, but no one ever referred to her as a leader again. I stayed, but I didn't move upward. I moved underneath. No formal title. Just one layer deeper than anyone dared interfere with again. I became the shadow under every safeguard. The footnote no one wanted to admit they relied on. The invisible layer that made every new hire ask, "Who put this here?" And even when they didn't say my name, they knew the answer. One afternoon, I walked past a conference room and saw something on the screen. A workflow, familiar. A diagram, mine. One of the younger managers had added a heading. Legacy architecture, untouchable without written rationale. They didn't know I was standing outside, and that was enough. Because the work had outlived the war. The lesson had embedded itself deeper than punishment ever could. They once deducted my salary for being 2 minutes late. Now they delayed deployments by 2 weeks, just to make sure they understood what they were changing. That's not retribution, that's justice, redesigned as memory. And the most powerful legacy is the one no one can undo, because no one dares forget who wrote it.